Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit of a ghost story, and the story is that of cholera and a map called the Ghost Map by Jon Snow, and this is the birth of epidemiology and how it came about. So we'll talk a little bit about this, and the title of the book where I got a lot of the information was Stephen Johnson's 2006 The Ghost Map. This is a definitely highly recommended book, and he did a tremendous job of presenting this historical event as a compelling story and really fleshing out the historical characters. While the book is not historical fiction, he creates a strong narrative and he does a really good job of developing these people as characters. You actually really want to know them at the end of the book. So, the main characters, the city of London, England itself, in August 1854. Jon Snow, who is an anesthesiologist. Henry Whitehead is a priest in the Anglican Church. Edwin Chadwick is the head of the Board of Health. And Vibrio cholera, a deadly bacterium. So, good old Victorian England, it's probably not as steampunk as you may have actually imagined it. And a lot of child labor, a lot of filth, and kind of more horrible than we actually romanticize it as being. So, this was named for Queen Victoria. Obviously, Victorian England was during Queen Victoria's reign. She was at the time, longest reigning monarch in British history and reigned from approximately 1838 to 1901. And she had some famous quotes. One of them is, "We are not amused," and the other was, "Lie back and think of England." And it's kind of interesting that these quotes were attributed to her because apparently she was actually frequently amused, and she and Albert had something on the order of 10 different children, and she penned several different letters talking about their love affair. So, in terms of both of these, they may not have been reflective of who she actually was as a monarch. You probably know the Victorian Age as steampunk. There was definitely an increase in transportation, the Industrial Revolution, and communication capabilities. Railroads kind of came into widespread use, and the first postage stamps appeared during this time. Pictured here is the penny black, which was the first postage stamp ever issued. And they're not as rare as you might actually think, but it was the first one that was actually issued. There was also a great increase in population, and they managed to avoid the Malthusian trap of increasing population without running out of food. There was, however, a lot of poverty, industrial expansion, and with it came child labor. And obviously, this was the age of the British Empire, and the saying was the sun never set on the British Empire. There were numerous advances in medicine made. Surgery and dentistry were definitely safer. Ether, much to Hunter S. Thompson's delight, was used for anesthesia. Chloroforms and anesthetics, which were attributed to John Lister, which you may know from Listerine mouthwash. Literature, Charles Dickens, the Bronte sisters, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote Sherlock Holmes, Thomas Hardy wrote a large number of cool, depressing pieces of poetry. And definitely a great age for literature. Dickens here does not look amused, but it was a great age for literature. In terms of London itself, in 1800, the population was about 1 million people. By 1854, that exploded to 2.4 million. And it was the most populous city on the planet. It was 90 square miles with very little infrastructure, and as you can see from these etchings, doesn't look like a awesome place to be living, despite the romantic notions of Victorian England. And the jobs kind of sucked. A lot of them centered around the Thames River. So bone pickers and rag gatherers are, pretty much exactly what you would think they were. These were people who picked at the bones and the scraps and found things attached to them, rings or anything else. Rag gatherers gathered rags from around the city, collected them, and resold them. Pure finders, an interesting job. These are people who went out and found dog manure because it was used in the leather tanning process. Dredgermen and mudlarks worked along the Thames River, and when the tides rose and fell, they would go on the shores and find things that the Thames River had left behind. It's still a pretty filthy river if you've been there. Sewer hunters, exactly what you think, and bunters, toshers, and shoremen also harvested things from the Thames. So there are a lot of pretty bad jobs. Of course, the kind of worst one was night soilman. And as the popular book says, everybody poops. And London had cesspools just like the Big Island. But there were also piles of shit as high as houses. And what you did was if you needed to poop, you would store your excrement in the basement. And you would then hire a night soilman to come and remove the human waste from your cesspool when it got overflowing or from your basement, as the case may be. They would then take it to the country to the farmers who would allow us to avoid that Malthusian trap. And these guys were pretty well compensated. They got a fee from the house owner to remove the excrement. Typically, we're given a bottle of gin as a tip, and after they hauled it out to the countryside, they got paid again when they sold the product to farmers. So maybe it wasn't the worst one. I think probably Pure Finder was probably a pretty bad job. You can still actually have this job in India, although they've technically outlawed it. There are people who go in there and actually fish out the excrement and haul it out to the country. This person here performing that job doesn't look particularly amused, and I don't think it's something I'd like to be doing. So I'll stick with teaching computer science, and hopefully you'll all stick with programming. There are worse careers out there. The story takes place in the Soho district of London, and its name probably came from a hunting cry. There have been Soho itself has been several different things, starting out as farm and hunting land, becoming aristocratic. At the time that the cholera outbreak took place in 1854, it was lower working class. And then it kind of moved to an artist haunt. Later took on a number of sex shops and nightlifes, and now it's a trendy nightlife district, which is this image is pictured from a tourism website. So come visit Soho. So it's actually kind of a cool place to hang out nowadays in London. So we'll talk about Jon Snow. He was a physician. And he lived from 1813 to 1858. Had kind of working class origins, graduated from the University of London, the Royal College of Physicians, and he calculated doses for anesthesia and even administered it to the Queen during childbirth. He had an office in Soho, which is why he plays a particular role in all of this. Henry Whitehead was the cleric for the Church of England in the Soho district, and he served at St. Luke's. Church of England is the Anglican church, which kind of took off after Henry VIII decided he needed a divorce from his wife. And next we'll talk about Edwin Chadwick. He was trained as a lawyer and the director of the Board of Health. He worked to eliminate child labor and to actually bring sewers to London. So he did a lot of good things, but one thing he had a weakness for was a theory of disease called miasma, which is all smell is disease. And basically, you can see evolutionarily why this would be a prevalent theory of disease. If something smelled bad, we tended to stay away from it. Rotting flesh or something we couldn't eat, it would typically have a bad smell, and we stayed away from it. So, this theory of miasma was that disease was caused by bad smells or foul air. And it had a large number of adherents, particularly at this time in the 1850s, because we hadn't yet invented germ theory. And of course, V. cholera, which is a bacterial infection of the small intestine that causes large amount of watery diarrhea. It causes profuse watery diarrhea, and up to 40% of patients die if untreated. Major cause of death in many countries in the past. Epidemics are now less common, but it remains an important cause of death in the developing world, particularly in Africa, according to PubMed. Cholera-related diarrhea comes on suddenly and may cause a quick, dangerous fluid loss, as much as a quart, 0.95 liters per hour. Diarrhea due to cholera often has a pale, milky appearance that resembles water in which rice has been rinsed. It also has nausea and vomiting associated with it, and the dehydration is really the killer. Depending upon how many body fluids you lose, dehydration can range from mild to severe, and a loss of 10% or more of total body weight would indicate severe dehydration. So that's one of the things that cholera actually does to kill its victims. Treatment is actually pretty simple. Rehydration and replacement of electrolytes. The Gatorade here is not a joke. At a minimum level, water or Gatorade will do this. But you can also administer fluids intravenously, and there are far better solutions, but a quick and simple fix, and one that's been exported to the developing world, is Gatorade. So here's King Cholera. Of course, we didn't have Gatorade back in the 1854. We had King Cholera, who was not a nice guy. So we can start out Monday, August 28th. Thomas and Sarah Lewis live at 40 Broad Street in an 11-room house with 20 inhabitants. So you can imagine that's even worse than MTV's The Real World. On August 28th, their infant daughter begins vomiting and emitting watery green stools. Sarah calls a doctor, cleans up the mess, and tosses the foul water in the cesspool in front of their house. On August 30th, the tailor at 40 Broad Street begins to feel ill. By September 2nd, the outbreak was in full swing. 3/4 of the population would flee the area within a week. By the end of the outbreak, over 600 people in Soho would die of the disease. Coffins were so numerous that they were put on top of hearses as well as inside, according to the Observer, which was a paper at the time. During the outbreak, Whitehead ministered to the sick and the dying, and on Tuesday, September 5th, the Board of Health arrives to tour the scene of the outbreak. Benjamin Hall has been replaced by Chadwick. They soaked the streets in chloride lime as a preventative measure. Why did they do that? Well, the main reason is this miasma theory of disease. If we get rid of the foul smells associated with the Victorian era London, then we get rid of the disease. But that didn't quite happen. And so, again, this miasma theory, all smell is disease. So Chadwick was the chief proponent of this. Disease among the working classes was caused by atmospheric impurities produced by decomposing animal and vegetable substances, by damp and filth in close and overcrowded dwellings. Where these circumstances are removed by drainage, proper cleansing, better ventilation, and other means, the frequency and intensity of such disease is abated. The annual loss of life from filth and bad ventilation are greater than the loss of death or wounds in any wars in which the country has engaged in modern time. And he was not the only proponent of this theory of disease. And, you can see this theory take several different forms throughout the course of history. Of course, here is pictured a plague doctor. They would put herbs and flowers in the mass to make it smell nice so they wouldn't get infected by the bubonic plague. Unfortunately, it didn't quite work that way. But, this miasma theory was quite popular. Snow, however, believed that cholera was being spread through human waste getting into water. And he published this theory about 5 years prior to the Soho outbreak. He begins investigating the Soho area with the help of Whitehead, the cleric from the local Anglican church. He asks a lot of questions, but he wants to know where people got their water. Snow found the vast majority of the victims were taking their water from the Broad Street pump. Apparently, they thought that pump had sweeter tasting water. The vast majority of deaths occurred in the area surrounding the pump. Those who died farther away also favored the Broad Street water and would actually go to Broad Street to get it. 73 of the 83 deaths recorded in Forest Weekly returns were closer to the Broad Street pump than any other water source, and 61 of the 73 were habitual drinkers of Broad Street water. Now, the Lime Brewery, the Workhouse, and Eli Brothers Factory were also close, but they used separate water supplies, and particularly for the beer, because they needed to have more purified water. And so beer saved my life. If you worked at the Lime Brewery at the time, it probably definitely helped save your life. So by September 7th, Snow addresses the Board of Governors of St. James Parish with his theory, and he asks them to remove the pump handle from the Broad Street pump. The board complies and removes the handle. The outbreak stopped shortly thereafter. Now, the initial outbreak may have already begun abating since no more cholera could get into the water supply. The well was excavated and showed leakage from the 40 Broad Street address where she threw out the waste from the child. The Vestry Committee upholds Snow's findings, but the Board of Health remained unconvinced. We see no reason to adopt this belief. Snow began working on a map of the Broad Street outbreak in the fall of 1854, and he used black bars to mark the locations of deaths. The bars around the Broad Street pump were striking. Cholera wasn't lingering over the neighborhood in a miasma form. It was radiating from a single point. And Snow's map draws upon a mathematical tool called a Varinoid Diagram. It takes the shape of a two-dimensional field made up of points surrounded by cells. The cells define the region around each point that's closer to a particular point than any other one in the diagram. And he used the water pumps as those points. So here is his actual ghost map. And you can see Broad Street kind of located there in the center, along with the pump. And you can see the black bars or the deaths radiating out from where that pump is located. And this is actually quite dramatic and shows that it was actually water that was spreading the disease. Cholera returned to London in 1866, a scant 12 years later. This time there were more than 4,000 deaths. William Farr undertook the investigation with Whitehead's help. 93% of the dead were customers of East London Water, which was taken from the Thames River, and it was near where a sewer line was emptying. Farr delivers a resounding critique of the Board of Health's report. In 1883, Robert Koch isolated cholera under a microscope, and its publication results reached England. Pacini had seen the microbe in 1854 and published about it, but it never reached England in that time. And so this was the beginning of germ theory replacing miasma theory. Snow's theory was finally vindicated, and his map becomes the birth of the field of epidemiology, and is one of the first examples of a geographical information system map. Snow is celebrated in Soho with a handleless pump still standing and a pub that is named in his honor. So if you do go to Soho, you can have a drink at the Jon Snow pub, but not from the Broad Street pump. Thanks for listening.